morning.
Good morning.
Well, don't worry, even though I'm from Nonprofits Assistance Fund, I'm not going to talk to you about finance or accounting or debits or credits or capital campaigns, not on a Saturday morning and not at this forum. Usually I'm kind of the practical one on the speaker docket, but today I'm thinking a little bit bigger picture. Because to me, kind of the underlying question, the obstacle and the opportunity is the question of risk. Nonprofits Assistance Fund lends to nonprofits, as you heard. We lend to nonprofits for all kinds of purposes and all kinds of reasons and uses: social services, the arts, healthcare, schools, affordable housing. Over the years, we've lent about $85 million to nonprofits in Minnesota, and our historical loss ratio is about 1%. So when I tell people what we do, I usually get one of two reactions. One is, oh my gosh, that sounds so risky. How can you do that? How could nonprofits possibly pay you back? The other side is 1% loss ratio. That's so low. You must not take very many risks. Well, I think we take lots of risks, but the goal is to take smart risks and risks that are productive and that are helpful. But one of the things that this teaches me is that risk to one is not the same as risk to another. And I think that that tension point around what's at risk, what's at stake, actually causes obstacles as we try and do important big picture projects. You know, when any of us consider whether or not to act on an idea, we're deciding to take a risk. And when we ask others to join us in acting on an idea, we're asking them to take a risk. But I think that we need to learn how to understand what all the facets are of risk. So my definition for today is that risk is the future probability that something will go wrong. You know, the future event that has a probability of occurrence and a likelihood of either loss or change in the outcomes that we're going to accomplish. And most importantly, it's when things go wrong and it matters, when there's something at stake for us. So to manage risk together, because all of these projects require collaboration, we have to find a way to understand these risk factors from different viewpoints and understand how to manage them together. So first of all, risk requires honesty. What could go wrong? What could go wrong? You know, you can make lists and lists and lists. And so it's worth the time and planning to figure that out, the willingness to face the possibilities. And know that the risks that we identify are really based on a space, a time, and a place. So if we were to make a list of financial risks in 2011, it's going to be a different list than it would have been in 2006. And the list of what could go wrong depends on different viewpoints and what matters. So consider an arts center and a school that are doing a project together. The arts center may see the biggest risk in the cost overrun possibilities. The school may see the biggest risk in the timing because they need it to be ready by September 1st for school to start. So we have to understand the different perspectives. But in many ways, the heart of understanding risk is understanding the probabilities. What's the likelihood that something could go wrong? And it really requires realistic information, data, some number crunching, and some real honesty, because too often, caught up in the enthusiasm of a project, we think it's no risk. Nothing could couldn't possibly go wrong. And overconfidence doesn't help us to manage risk. So this is a time for research and data on important factors and consideration of a range of possible outcomes. I mean, what's the likelihood of a program attracting new participants or a capital campaign working? Excel is a great tool, but it's not a research. It's not research. So sometimes we rely a little too much on that magic formula. So, you know, there are always things, though, that can go wrong. And so one of the questions is, how much will it matter? This matrix, I think, is a really useful way to focus on the risks that matter, the risks that we really need to plan for. Emotions play a big part in dealing with risk and managing risk, and being kind of systematic about it can help to dial that down a little bit and really focus. A lot of the research that's been done about risk comes out of economics and finance, and one of the interesting findings is that when a new set of information is added, it tends to get overweighted when we're thinking about risk. which means that new information can get us to focus too much on, frankly, low impact risk just because it's new. We hadn't considered it before. So again, being very systematic about it can be helpful. But tolerance for risk isn't entirely measurable. Why does one partner in a project willing to move on a 50% probability and another needs 90? And because of that, the matrix won't look the same for every partner or every funder or every person in a project. And we have to find a way to this is a place where it's good to step out of our own heads and think about what would this look like for some of our partners, and what can we do together to get everybody's risk more manageable and acceptable. These kind of misunderstandings and misalignments in risk, I think, often cause the most stress and tension. It's also helpful to think about where we're starting. Risk is often a matter of perception, and you perceive it based on your starting point. Here's another piece of research that's interesting. If you perceive the project as a gain, and your partner or your collaborator or your funder as primarily the possibility of loss, losses are weighted more than gains. Psychology research has shown this, so that even when the situation is identical. So in many community projects, this is really important because sometimes the biggest risk is the possibility is not doing something. But in those situations, this imbalance is even greater. So this is particularly important when there are real differences in the power dynamics or in the size. Here's a little case study, and I know you drove by it on the tour yesterday, kind of how risk got managed together. The Open Book is a home to 3 literary arts organizations in Minnesota, the Loft Literary Center, Milkweed Editions, and the Minnesota Center for Book Arts. Together, over a course of 4 years, they formed a new entity to own the building, did a $7 million capital campaign, and each one of them essentially changed their organizations to take advantage of this new space. They did it together in 100-year-old buildings. Each organization had their own goals that they had to balance, but they really also had to learn to understand the others because they were all at different places and coming from different perspectives, and they had to really adjust. If we can honestly identify the risks and the impact and use good information to weigh the likelihood, mostly what we want to do is reduce the possibility. We want to change their place in that matrix. So for Open Book, for example, some of the things that happened is that for one of the organizations suddenly had an urgent need to move before the building was ready. The building, not surprisingly, I did say that these were 300-year-old buildings, went over budget. The capital campaign had to be increased by 20%. So this one of the partners almost had to pull out because they had to move out of their current space. So the other partners had to rally together to address that problem, even though it wasn't their specific problem. So how do you adapt and change? One of the other things that happened during the Open Book project is that contractors, like to be paid in cash, not pledges. So one of the commitments that they had made at the beginning was to have a debt-free project. So they had 2 risks. One was they didn't want debt. The other was they couldn't delay by 3 years to collect their pledges. So part of managing risk is, again, thinking about that matrix and how do you offset? So they decided to take a cash bridge loan against the pledges, paid off as soon as they could in order to stay on timeline. So they offset one risk that they felt had a bigger impact for one that they felt they could control. Managing risk is all about how do we reduce the impact, move it down into the kind of the lower side of that matrix. These 2 adages often come up, frankly, when we're doing big, important projects. They're both true, and even almost more important, neither is untrue. So if you find yourself between look before you leap and he who hesitates is lost, that's where risk is. And if you think about drawing a bar across the top of that and you put every single partner in a project together and line them up and figure out where they are, both of these adages are true and neither is untrue. So how do you then move everyone together to satisfy all of the risks and get the project done? with less stress, more possibility of success, and frankly, better relationships. So it's all about risk.